We just want to tell everybody thanks so much for watching our last video on the murder in Coweta County story. And so we thought we'd follow up. But I wanted to tell you that our research comes from a few places. One, interviewing some people that we know in the area here in Meriwether and Coweta County, Georgia. And also from this awesome book by Dot Moore called Oracle of the Ages. This was something that Mayhayley called herself on the witness stand and several times in newspaper reports. She said she was the Oracle of the Ages. And then we also have this really cool big book, Heard County History, loaned to us by Teresa Bryan. Her family, the Bryans, are listed in this book by Dot Moore because Clara Bryan, actually three of my grandchildren's great-great-grandmother, Clara Bryan, was a minister's wife, and she was sitting in the house with Mayhayley and Mayhayley's family when Mayhayley passed away. This source here, this book from Heard County, it goes all the way back to the Native American Indians and right through, and a big chapter is about Mayhayley Lancaster. She was very forward-thinking in her political views. Back in those days, there was a poll tax, and if you couldn't afford to pay the tax, well, then you didn't get to vote. She didn't think this was right because a lot of poor people were not able to vote. She thought that everyone, including women and blacks, had the right to vote. She believed all children, black and white, should have equal opportunity to education. So here's some of the interesting history that we've drawn from these sources. I want to give a shout out to everyone who's helped us with this. And let's keep going with the video. Hope you enjoy the story of two unusual characters, John Wallace and Amanda Mayhayley Lancaster. Their paths crossed several times throughout their lives. And we found it, Brewsterville. We are looking for Caney Head Methodist Church. I want to tell you a little bit about Mayhayley Lancaster. She called herself an Oracle of the Ages. She was born with what was called a caul over her face. It was said that if you were born with a caul over your face, that you had second sight. And she indeed could tell the future. She told people the lucky numbers for a game called the Bug Game, an early lottery type of game in the 1920s and 30s and into the 1940s. She told fortunes, and people would come to see her from all types of states and all around. It is said that the neighbors would just get a kick out of coming over to see all the license tags. People from Florida, Texas, Illinois, Arkansas, all around the country came to get their fortunes told from Mayhayley Lancaster. Now, we're out here at the grave site. One of the interesting things I want to show you before we find Mayhayley's grave, which I believe is right over there, we are going to talk about the fact that one of the things she did, she predicted things in threes. She would tell you, you would find a lost article or a husband or a family member or cows, in John Wallace's case, but it was always in threes. 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, and things would happen in threes. And an interesting thing out here at the cemetery is the threes. Number threes are interesting to me. And this gentleman right here, Albert Chapman, Mark found it, 1933. He was born in 1966. He passed away. Mayhayley would find that fascinating, I'm sure, because he lived 33 years. Now we're going to go on over here. There's Mark. He has found her grave. And we have found Mayhayley. Mark found Mayhayley. Amanda Mayhayley Lancaster. was born October 18th, 1875, and she died November 22nd, 1955. I'll replace these flowers, Mayhayley. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I just want to show folks. It said, her stone reads, "For neither did his brethren believe in him." St. John 17, chapter 5th verse. Now, some people thought that was wrong for Mayhayley to compare herself to the Lord, to Jesus, but I believe it was just a saying that she pulled. She studied the scriptures.
Where's a dollar and a dime?
I've got my dollar and a dime. If you came to Mayhayley to get your fortune told, the payment was a dollar and a dime. Here is a dollar for you and a dime for your dogs. Mayhayley was the third of 11 children born to Harriet Lancaster. Now, Mayhayley had a bigger stone out here previously, but one of the stories goes that a young man, his parents had their fortune told by Mayhayley on their honeymoon, not far from here at a resort where they were staying, and she was telling people's fortunes. She told the young couple that they would have a son and that he would grow up to be a teacher. Well, that son did grow up to be a teacher, and he brought his students out here one day to tell them the stories he'd heard about Mayhayley. When they were here, and the stone was taller than, this is not her original stone at all. The stone was taller. He was talking to his students about her, and a lightning storm came, and it struck the stone, and the stone split. You'll also notice that Mayhayley is interred in a solid piece of cement. This is because people have come before and tried to desecrate her grave. I know that there was some mention of a scientific group, a school, that had offered the Lancaster family $1 million for Mayhayley's brain after she died. Well, of course, they refused. But there are people that rumored that she is here, but her brain is not. I hope that's not true. I hope that that's not true for Miss Mayhayley. Take a moment to look. Take a moment to just kind of feel the place. That's what I'd like to do. Ghost hunters and other paranormal folks have come out here before. Now, Mayhayley is quite the character. She did tell people a lot of fortunes. She, of course, became extremely famous for a couple of her stories. One was the story of a group of teenagers that came to visit her one afternoon, just sort of on a lark, as they said. And she told the fortune of every teenager there, except for one young girl. And one of the boys who had visited Mayhayley before, as they were leaving, he said, "Ms. Lancaster, why won't you tell her fortune? Why won't you tell her future?" And she told the boy simply, "She has no future." And that evening, that group of teenagers was in a car crash, and that girl was killed. She indeed had no fortune, and Mayhayley forecasted that on the afternoon of her death. They say Mayhayley most often walked to church, and someone even remarked one time that the only time they ever saw her get a ride to church was when the hearse brought her from her home, where she had been laid out and lots of people came to visit her and see her. The lines were tremendously long to see her. And she rode here to church for her service, and her burial in a hearse. So Mayhayley lived in a shack similar to the one behind me. Her home did burn down. It was in Heard County near Caney Head Church, where we were a few minutes ago. People would gather all in her yard from all states, from everywhere, just to have their fortunes read. It was said that her family set up a snack shack and a place to get a soda and a snack. Because of all the people, it was an extra way to make money. Now, interestingly, the shack had a lot of cracks in the walls, and in those days, people stuffed the walls with newspaper. Well, Mayhayley, who sort of hoarded her cash because she didn't trust the banks, she would stuff the walls with money. But then the sheriff said people are going to come steal your money, and people were coming and robbing her when she wasn't home. The sheriff came out and made her get all of the money up, and the neighbors helped and the sheriff's men helped. They gathered up $30,000 in cash out of the walls and in the yard of her shack. He took her to the bank, and the bank man said, "This money is filthy. It's got chicken poop on it. It's nasty. I'm not putting it in my bank." So Mayhayley went across the street to a store where the folks helped her clean the money before it could be deposited in a bank account. Well, she promised them she would pay them, and after 3 hours of sorting through this $30,000 worth of deposit, she gave each of the helpers a dime for their work. 3 hours of work, she paid them a dime. So she was thrifty with her money, you could say, in those areas. Now, another funny story, she, of course, people would line up and wait for her, and some folks finally got in for their 20 minutes for the dollar and the dime, and they went inside her home, the old shack, where Mayhayley would sit by the fireplace. Well, in the middle of the reading, she stopped and she said, "I want to hear my sister Sally play a tune on the piano." Sally came out and started playing the piano, and the folks say that as she pumped the pedals of the piano, cats started coming out of the piano. A total of 5 cats came out of the piano as Sally played the piano in a very uplifting song. I think that's very interesting. And like I said, people would wait on a porch, on her porch of a shed, an old ramshackle house, very similar to this one that sits right here in Georgia as well. Mayhayley Lancaster, quite the eccentric lady, quite an interesting story. Lots of stuff is still unknown about her, but wow, what stories we have to share about Mayhayley. One of the more famous stories about Mayhayley's forecasting or finding things, finding people and things, has to do with the Chattahoochee River. Now, there was a young man who had left one afternoon and said he was going to go fishing. The water was pretty rough, but he left anyway, and that night he did not return. And his young bride became very concerned about him, and she went to her father-in-law and said, "Hey, he didn't come back from a fishing trip, and I'm worried about him." So the family came looking in boats, and the whole area, folks came looking for him, and no one ever found him. So they went to Mayhayley, and Mayhayley told them to go back to the Chattahoochee River and look around the bend, and they would see him in the distance. He didn't have his jacket on anymore, but he still had his hat. And if they had come 3 days earlier, there's the 3 days again, that they would find him alive, but she did not believe that they would find him alive. And the family did follow her instructions, and they came out and they looked and they found the boy. Just as Mayhayley said, his hair was brushed across his face, and they found his body. And they were very sad that they hadn't asked Mayhayley 3 days before, because she believed they would have found him alive. But that is one of the very famous stories of Mayhayley and the lost fisherman. John Wallace frequently visited Mayhayley, Lancaster to get numbers for the bug game or to find missing objects. John Wallace was born in Georgia in 1896. His father passed away when John was still a very young man. John Wallace enlisted in the military and caught the Spanish flu while he was serving this country. John Wallace's mother wondered about his health and whereabouts for almost a year before he returned home. John Wallace worked the family farm. They grew cotton and corn. The corn they turned into corn mash and whiskey, which was run as far north as New York and Chicago. To protect this illegal operation, bootleggers notoriously would be paying off law enforcement officials. John Wallace was known to drown people nearly to death to get them to do what he wanted. He also shot a man dead in cold blood in downtown Chipley, Georgia, which is now Pine Mountain, on the street in front of eyewitnesses. Now, John Wallace married a very beautiful woman named Josephine, and they honeymooned and were married at what was then called the White Sulphur Springs Resort near Warm Springs, Georgia. John Wallace wasn't close to many people, but he was close to his one young neighbor, Dorothy Dunlap. She was 15 years younger than him. Some folks say it was a fatherly relationship. Other people say that it was more a romantic relationship. That's a mystery that we'll never know the answer to. He carried that to his grave. Wilson Turner was a sharecropper on John Wallace's large kingdom. He started running moonshine, bootlegging, without giving John Wallace his cut of the profits. John Wallace fired Wilson Turner and kicked him off his land. In retaliation, Wilson Turner stole 2 of John Wallace's cows. When Mayhayley told John Wallace that a man named Turner had his 2 cows that were missing, that he'd stolen them, she also told John Wallace, "Don't you go doing anything to him. Don't you go killing him." In April of 1948, Wilson Turner was brought here to the Meriwether County Courthouse. Wilson Turner spent 2 nights in the Meriwether County Jail for stealing 2 cows. When he left the jail, he saw John Wallace waiting for him with 2 accomplices. So he jumped in his truck and sped northward on Highway 27, trying to flee Meriwether County. John Wallace dumped Wilson Turner's body into a well. But Lamar Potts was snooping around the property, and John Wallace knew that he had to move the body back out of the well. But the problem with that was he didn't know which well he had dumped the body in, so he went to see Mayhayley again. And this time she told him in the third well that he looked in, he would find the package that she knew was Wilson Turner's. She told him, "I told you not to kill that man. I told you not to kill that man. You're going to pay for this. John Wallace, you'll pay." Well, pretty petrified, he came back to his property, and with a grappling hook in the third well that he looked, he found the package. He pulled it out and he burned it in a large fire pit. John Wallace started a large bonfire that the neighbors could see stretch 60 feet into the air, the flames. This was an attempt to incinerate the body of Wilson Turner. 2 black farm hands from John Wallace's property were enlisted to drag the body here to the bonfire. Albert Brooks and Robert Lee Gates testified in the Coweta County courthouse in Noonan, Georgia, that they had brought a package that they believed to be the body of Wilson Turner here to a fire pit on John Wallace's Meriwether County property. Although it was a large fire, the body would not be completely incinerated, leaving bone fragments that Robert Lee Gates and Albert Brooks carried to a creek and dumped. After Sheriff Potts was told by Mayhayley Lancaster to look in a well for the body of Wilson Turner, he found brain matter deep in the bottom of one well. When Sheriff Potts went to see Mayhayley about the body of Wilson Turner, she told the sheriff, she got very upset and said, "Fire, fire, fire." And she told him that John Wallace had burned the body of Wilson Turner, and that if he were to look in the creek, he would find what remains there were of that body. John Wallace was prosecuted for the death of Wilson Turner. He was kept at the old jail, which is no longer here, but was right here on the square. You can see it's still a busy little town. Now, this was the last place that Wallace and Mayhayley ever crossed paths in their lives. This was the place. He saw her arrive here by a state trooper car. He thought, oh, she's coming to testify in my defense. That wasn't the case. She was here to testify against him. When she arrived at the courthouse, he saw her from his jail cell, and he was so excited. And once she took the stand, he realized that she was testifying against him. She would tell the court all of the things that John Wallace had ever told her in what he thought was confidence during one of the sessions. where he had paid $1 and a dime to get his fortune told. She told the court all of the things that her and John Wallace had ever talked about, including looking for Wilson Turner's body in a creek and in a well. She testified about how he told her he killed Wilson Turner because Wilson Turner had taken his cows. And if you remember, she's the one who told John Wallace that Turner had his cows. So she knew the whole story all along. And she indeed came here to testify against him. When she arrived at the courthouse, there was a flurry, a crowd. Everyone is excited to see Mayhayley. She had such an interesting personality and reputation. People mobbed her, asking her for predictions of whether John Wallace would be found guilty or not, and responded to them as far as how the trial would work. Well, a fool's pay is a fool's way. The testimony became quite a banter between her and his defense attorney, and she even told him one time he questioned her ability to see things, her vision, ability to have visions. And she said, well, crawfish have eyes in their tails, and I've got eyes inside my head. I can see things. And he said, oh, you can see things. What about me? And she told the attorney flat out, well, you may end up where John Wallace ends up. And that kind of put him aside a little bit. John Wallace was found guilty based on the witness testimony of Mayhayley Lancaster and also the 2 hired hands who testified that they helped John Wallace move the body. Those 2 farm hands did testify here in court at this courthouse. This is the very first courthouse in the state of Georgia where 2 black men were able to come into court and testify. John Wallace was the first white man in Georgia to be found guilty of murder on the witness account of 2 black men. Made history. During his 2 years on death row, John Wallace read the scripture. He also made notes in the Bible frequently. He believed that he would get out of trouble eventually, but he did not. John Wallace spent 2 years on death row making notes and plans. He got with his attorney and made out his will and left everything to Dorothy Dunlap. The attorney said, John, you haven't left anything to your wife, Josephine. And with that, John Wallace simply said, she can get a job. John Wallace was generous with his money when it came to the church. Like Mayhayley, he attended church services regularly. And also like Mayhayley, John Wallace is buried on the grounds of his church that he attended his entire life. John Wallace was known to be a mean man, but some people thought he was a nice guy. He even told somebody once that he sat up with a dead body all night long while the family went to bed. Thanks so much, everybody, for tagging along on this little adventure, finding out more about John Wallace and Mayhayley, Lancaster. Please, if you get a chance, it's free to subscribe. It's going to help us bring even more histories and mysteries.